Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today I'll be discussing the subject of Maqasid al-Sharia, the goals and purposes of Sharia. If we replace this the second word, we can easily say the goals and purposes of Islam itself. It would not be inaccurate. Maqasid al-Sharia is a subject that has invoked a renewed interest in recent decades. There is a plethora of writings, articles, books, conferences, PhDs on the subject of maqasid. A jurisprudence of maqasid is in the making, partly because the maqasid are versatile. They relate more directly to human life situation and also provides perhaps a more accessible approach to the resources of the Sharia compared to usul al-fiqh, to the science and doctrines of Islamic jurisprudence. And I will explain a little about that. It is partly because the usul al-fiqh has become a little overburdened with technicalities. It is a very well developed aspect of the Sharia, yet so well developed that sometimes it can be a little further removed from the objectives of legislation in lawmaking in our times. It also provides the maqasid perhaps more accessible tools for legislation and ijtihad. I will be looking also to some extent at the weaknesses of the maqasid. One of the main points of weaknesses that critics have highlighted is that the methodology of the maqasid is not as well developed as those of that of the usul al-fiqh doctrines. And that is why I have written 2 chapters perhaps in this book, Sharia Law and Introduction. Chapter 6 is on the history and methodology of maqasid, page 123 to 141. And this is the chapter I'll be using in my discussion today. There is also an occasional paper series published by the IIIT, International Institute of Islamic Thought, based in London, Maqasid al-Sharia Made Simple. This is also a 2010 publication, occasional paper series 13. There are other references. Some of my writings on the subject occur in different places. But the Kuala Lumpur edition of my Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence also has a good chapter on the maqasid. It is also natural to approach a subject by reference to the higher goals and objectives of the discipline we are about to study. The students and researchers of Islamic law also take interest through the maqasid to know the Sharia and make this a starting point. What are the intentions, the objectives and the goals of Sharia in its different parts? I would be discussing the subject of any textual authority in the Quran and Sunnah. Is there any support for this, for the maqasid of Sharia? Then the history of juristic thought and contributions of prominent scholars to the subject. What is the definition of the maqasid? Then the classification of maqasid. How are they identified? The identification of maqasid and the relevance of maqasid for ijtihad. And the last three, definition, classification, identification, and relevance to ijtihad, this, in other words, provides the methodology of ijtihad. The maqasid al-sharia also represent a latent development in the in the progress of the history of Islamic thought. The usul al-fiqh was more or less at its final stages of development by the end of the 3rd century or 9th century Common Era. But the maqasid started, in fact, in attracting interest around 10th century Common Era, well about 3 or 4 centuries after the completion of usul al-fiqh. And there was a reason for that. The usul al-fiqh as a discipline of the Sharia is focused on text readings and semantics, and the literalist kind of orientation I have also earlier mentioned of usul al-fiqh, whereas the maqasid is more theoretical, a little philosophical, asking questions as to the intention of the law, the underlying philosophy of legislation. And the scholars of usul al-fiqh were somewhat reluctant to develop these kind of philosophical themes, although they have never denied the importance of the maqasid, yet they have somehow not given it a high profile in the study of the Sharia, which is why there is some disagreement over the details of the methodology of the maqasid. The first time the maqasid were mentioned was in the 4th or 10th century Hijrah. References to the maqasid were made by Tirmizi al-Hakim. And then al-Juwayni, Imam al-Haramain, the teacher of Imam al-Ghazali, for the first time referred to this triple classification of the maqasid, as I will be later discussing. And then al-Ghazali identified the essential maqasid into 5. And then juristic thought developed progressively on the subject. I will be discussing that, but before that I will give 1 or 2 examples why the maqasid are interesting, more direct, more relevant to the concerns of human life, and issue questions. For example, there was this with reference to the charity of Fitr on the occasion of Eid al-Fitr, marking the fasting month of Ramadan. Muslims give a charity in the name of Fitr. In the hadith literature, because of the fact that the staple food of Medina and Mecca during the time of the Prophet were dates, in wheats, in barley, references in hadith to Sadaqat al-Fitr occur in that you give it in kind. This Imam Abu Hanifa asked the question that what if they are given in their monetary value? And his fatwa in response to that question was that it is fine, it is valid to give the sadaqah of fitr in its monetary equivalent. Why? Because the purpose of giving charity is to address the issue of need in poverty. And giving help to a needy person in monetary terms is equally acceptable. So if you follow the letter of the text, then you have to give it in kind. But if you follow the purpose, then this also opens a different avenue. In the Quran, another example, there is a verse that when you see the moon, فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْهُ. When you see the new moon of Ramadan, then you start fasting. The text here mentions eyesight. Is it therefore a requirement that the moon must be sighted, or can we perhaps work on computation and the kind of the calendar specification would be equally good? And a question has been raised and the answer given that it is equally valid. It is not necessary that you must sight the moon through eyesight. Through computation would be equally good. Finally, another example. You may apply the punishments. For example, the had punishment of adultery or false accusation. There are textually prescribed penalties for these offenses. There are times when this is the normal course. When someone commits an offense, you apply the punishment. But there are times when this is not the best course. You either take the literalist approach of applying the hudud for the sake of the hudud, or you look at the objective of the purpose of what is the purpose of punishment. If it is justice or reforming the individual, then that is the higher objective. So there is a difference between the literalist approach to the reading of Sharia and one which is goal-oriented, maqasid-oriented. Is there any evidence in the Quran in support of the maqasid? Well, the Quran, it is said, from beginning to end, is very much inclined towards identifying the goals and purposes of its ahkam, of its laws. In many, many ways, references are given. Some of them are direct, others are indirect. Some of these objectives are very broad and universal to the entire Sharia in Islam itself, like compassion and mercy, rahmah, for example. In the Quran, Surah 10, verse 57, characterizes the Quran as a healing to the spiritual ailments of the heart, in guidance, in rahmah, in mercy for the believers. The Quran, this is the objective of the revelation of the Quran, in other words. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala characterized himself by his most beautiful names. And two of the most favorite of his own names are, one is Ar-Rahman, the characterization of most beneficent and most merciful. This is once again the Prophet, the mission of the Prophet Muhammad is characterized as a mercy for the world in Surah 21, 107. This is the great grand objective of Islam, of prophethood, of the Quran, the purpose of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala itself. And the larger other objectives of Islam is respect for human dignity, fulfillment of justice, of doing good to others, good moral characteristics, and trustworthiness. There is plenty of evidence in the sources in support of these being the higher objectives of Islam in the Sharia. More specifically, there are references in the Quran, for example, with reference to charity in zakat, كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ, so that wealth is not concentrated only in the hands of the rich. And this is the purpose of charity in zakat. The purpose and the objective of jihad, of struggle in the path of Allah, is explained in another verse. because those who are permitted to resort to fighting is because they were subjected to oppression. أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا. So fighting oppression is the objective of jihad. Then we have وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاتٌ. In the law of retaliation there is protection of life for you. The Quran explains, in other words, the objective of its own laws. In the Sunnah, there are many references. Some scholars have gone on record to say that such references reach nearly 1,000. Maybe this is something very characteristic of the Quran, not just delivering the rules, the do's and don'ts, as we have in parliamentary legislation. Parliamentary legislation do not give any details as to objectives, as to the benefit, or any, for example, the higher goals or the appeal that the Quran also make to the reason and conscience of the believer. These are some of the aspects of the Quran that are goal-oriented. We do not find this in parliamentary legislation. And the Sunnah also in many places identifies the benefit, goal, the rationale, the purpose, sometimes the adverse consequences of a certain conduct. And these are the ways how the scholars would look at in order to identify the objectives and purposes of the ahkam of Sharia. Perhaps the whole of this section, the discussion on maqasid, is encapsulated by one hadith, al-umuru bimaqasidiha. The affairs of people are judged by reference to their objectives. إنما الأعمال بالنيات, a similar hadith that people's actions are to be judged by reference to their underlying intentions. We have all of this in the Quran, yet the question still remains, why did the maqasid not find a prominent place in the doctrines and expositions of the usul al-fiqh? I have already made a reference to it because of its orientation to philosophy, and also to some extent the maqasid are open to value judgment like the maslahah itself. And the usul al-fiqh is somewhat reluctant to encourage such themes. It is with reference to the definition of the maqasid. And the ulama of usul did not provide a definition, nor did they develop any methodology for the maqasid. Even Imam al-Shatibi in 14th century Common Era, who was the main advocate of the maqasid, and wrote his 4-volume work Al-Muwafaqat, in which he developed the maqasid into a distinctive chapter of the Sharia. Even he did not give a definition to the maqasid, although he actually penetrates the methodology of the maqasid and makes significant contributions to that end. Yet he did not define it, perhaps partly because some words are so distinctive in conveying their purpose that you do not need a definition. The maqsad, the purpose, the objective of something is something that conveys a very clear meaning. But 20th century scholars, al-Fasi, provided a definition that the maqasid, the goals and purposes of Sharia, refer to the wisdom that the lawgiver has considered in the enactment of all of his rulings. This is briefly the definition of the maqasid, that the wisdom which may consist of benefit, of prevention of harm, human welfare, or whatever that may be, that the lawgiver has considered, has intended in authorizing, in issuing the rules, the ahkam of Sharia. There are other definitions, for example, Tahir ibn Ashur has given, but I would not go into the details of the definition as I have discussed it in my writings. But Ibn Ashur did characterize the maqasid in 4 points. One, that the purpose and goal of a hukum must be general in the sense that it applies to all the incidents of its application, and that it is constant, aam and sabit. It does not change with the change of circumstances. It is firm and permanent, and that it is zahir or self-evident. You do not need to resort to interpretations and analysis for it. And it is tard, it is self-contained and exclusive, that avoid confusion with other concepts. These are some of the characterization and definition of the maqasid. And Tahir ibn Ashur's book entitled Maqasid al-Sharia al-Islamiyya was itself a significant contribution to this subject. Now I briefly look at in the juristic contributions of the ulama to the subject. I mentioned earlier that the ulama and the scholars of jurisprudence and the mazahib, they have acknowledged the importance of the maqasid, yet they have not penetrated for a long time. It remained a dormant subject. And some contributions were made, but generally speaking, they were actually subsumed under other topics, under the topics of effective cause or illah, sometimes with regard to, for example, other topics like general custom or urf, even analogy in qiyas. We see references to the maqasid, but not really giving it a degree of prominence. None of the earlier texts of usul al-fiqh, for example, have a chapter dedicated to the maqasid. The English texts that we have in 20th century also do not, subjects on Islamic jurisprudence textbooks still have that. I have included that in my writings, but this is to say that it was a late comer to in the development of Islamic juristic thought. Except for the Zawahiri ulama who maintain that the maqasid only exist if there is a clear text to say that this is the objective of the Sharia, then we recognize the existence of the maqasid. Otherwise, the Zawahiri school do not recognize the maqasid as an independent aspect of the Sharia. All that we have are the text. If the text tells us that there is an objective, then there we stand. Otherwise, we will not formulate one to say that this is the text or this is the objective of the text. Also, the Batiniya or the Ismailiya, one school of the Shia, that they do not recognize the maqasid. There are others who have some reservations, but generally speaking, the jumhur, the majority of ulama, not only look at the text of the Sharia, but also the objective, the rationale, and the benefit and the other aspects of the text, as well as the objectives and the purposes of the text, is part of the reading of the ahkam of the Sharia. This is the Jumhur position. Yet within the ranks of the recognized school also we have certain shades of differences. Earlier I mentioned that ulama like Al-Ghazali, Al-Juwayni, they made a start on the discussion of the maqasid and the triple identification of maqasid into the essential, supplementary, indesirable, daruriyat, hajiyat, tahsiniyat. This occurs in the writings of Al-Juwayni, the teacher of Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali then developed this, the work of his teacher, then identified that the essential maqasid are 5, as we have referred to protection of the human self or life, protection of religion, protection of and promotion of property, of intellect, and of family in progeny. These are the essential maqasid. In masalih, maqasid in masalih, although they are not identical, but they are used interchangeably. Maslaha and maqsid, they are very closely aligned, and yet there are some differences. I have developed this in my writing, that the maqasid have a degree of permanence to it. Maslaha is very circumstantial. The maqasid are not. They have a permanence, a degree above that can justify the validity of the maslaha itself. But these classification, the triple classification, have also been taken in the discussion of the maqasid. Fakhruddin al-Razi, a Quran commentator, 13th century Common Era, also Saifuddin al-Amidi, a 13th century jurist of Usul al-Fiqh, they consider maqasid as a criteria of the preference of one qiyas over another. You see quite a low profile. Then Al-Qarafi, the Maliki jurist, Shahabuddin Al-Qarafi, identified an additional maqsid or purpose in addition to the 5 that Al-Ghazali identified, and this is the dignity and honor. Protection and promotion of the honor and dignity of the individual is also one of the essential objectives of Islam and its Sharia. This was supported by later in 14th century Wahabuddin al-Subki and then al-Shawkani in the 19th century. They supported Al-Qarafi's identification of ird or dignity. Why was it this identification related, numbered at 5 or 6? Actually, there is some connection between the maqasid and the punishments of the hudud, the prescribed penalties, because the prescribed penalties identify in a negative sense, imposing punishment for a value that you want to defend, to protect, whether it is property, whether it is life, whether it is honor. They arose in a way, the maqasid were extracted from the text reading of the Quran on the subject of the hudud. Whether this was the correct approach or not, that is perhaps somewhat later I will refer to when I review some other contributions of the scholars. Izzuddin Abdus Salam, a 13th century Shafi'i jurist, he went on record in his renowned book Qawaid al-Ahkam fi Masalih al-Anam, the essentials of the ahkam for the benefit of the people. Characteristic, even bringing the idea of benefits into the title of his renowned work. He said that God the Most High, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, did not enact a Sharia in order to benefit himself. He is above that. So the only other thing remaining is that the Sharia is revealed from beginning to end to realize welfare and benefit for human beings. In other words, the higher objective, maqsid of the Sharia, the mega objective, is human welfare. And then we have in the 14th century Ibn Taymiyyah, the prominent Hanbali jurist, who raised this question, an important question, asked this question: why are we saying that the maqasid are 5 or 6 in number? Look at the Quran. The Quran tells us that there are more than just a specific number of goals and objectives the Sharia vindicates and protects. On the subject of honesty and truthfulness, on the subject of purity, in terms of cleanliness, in terms of purity of character, for example, respect for one's parents, being observant of the kind of the ties of kinship, and even kindness and respect for one's neighbors. There is so much evidence for all of these and more. Are they not the objectives and maqasid of Sharia? If they are, then maqasid is an open chapter. It's an evolving chapter. It's not necessarily enumerated in any order, 5 or 6. It was an important development in the history of the maqasid. Ibn Taymiyyah's view has actually been taken in by 20th prominent scholars of Sharia in our times and earlier on. The contemporary scholar Yusuf al-Qaradawi, for example, he has identified social support, takaful, to those in need. The society has a responsibility to support them. Takaful is one of the objectives of the Sharia. The Quran is full of this support, whether charity, obligatory or optional for the poor and help. That is one. He also adds that protection of the freedom, personal freedom and liberty of the individual is one of the objectives of Islam. And then we have Al-Raisuni, Al-Jabiri, and others who have mentioned, for example, human dignity and justice also being the objectives of Sharia. In Jamaluddin Atiyah added and mentioned 24 maqasid. Those, they occur in 4 categories. Those which are of interest to the individual, to the family, to the ummah, the Muslim community, and to the humanity at large. He identifies a large number of maqasid in these 4 areas, and totaling at 24. In my writing, I have also added in our time, pursuit of peace, of international world peace, is one of the higher objectives of Islam in its Sharia. And R&D research, in research and development, the dignity and standing of the Ummah and international community depends on its inventiveness and contribution to science and technology. So in our times we can say this is part of the ilm, which is one of the maqasid. And perhaps protecting the fundamental rights and liberties as are expounded in contemporary readings of our constitutions. These are also important, and we can perhaps identify these, most of these, as part of the maqasid of Sharia. And then I move on to the classification of the maqasid. I have already mentioned the triple classification, which signifies the relative merit of the maqasid into essential maqasid, which are 5 or 6, as I mentioned, those which are supplementary, the supplementary maqasid, which are known as hajiyat. They refer to the second order objectives in terms of importance. For example, cleanliness and purity, giving charity and sadaqah beyond its minimum or limits, certain types of contracts that the Sharia has validated, despite some abnormality that may exist in the concessions that we have in all areas, whether it is performance of salat or hajj or other duties, there are concessions granted for certain situations and individuals. These are part of the supplementary maqasid. And then the more open category of tahsiniyat, those which are desirable. Compassion to animals, for example, being pleasant and polite, having a pleasant encounter, have a good word to say to people. These are part of the tahsiniyat. And we have, for example, one hospital in a particular district. You try to develop this to bring better facilities, to build on a second hospital, to bring specialized services. This is the essential aspect of health needs you have answered. But now we are engaged in bringing all that is desirable, that enhances upon what is essential, upon what is supplementary. Now, in our times, actually, it is mainly this aspect of development, whether economic, whether of science and technology, is basically the area of the tahsiniyat we are engaged in most cases. Then another classification of the maqasid is simple into two categories, definitive and speculative, qat'i and zanni. Qat'i are those which are supported by clear text in the Quran and Sunnah. Like we said, these 5 or 6 essential maqasid, or those which are known by the general reading of the Quran and Hadith, or known through general consensus and ijma. The speculative or zanni objectives are those that are less evident, like a certain area of knowledge one has to acquire the knowledge of fusul al-fiqh itself, for example. Is it an essential maqasid? One doesn't know. Liquor is prohibited, of course, but whether a small amount that does not intoxicate is also prohibited to the same sense. This is something that one doesn't know quite, whether this is qat'i or zanni. But the general consensus or ijma has this function that raises the level of identification of values from the level of speculative to the level of definitive. When consensus throws its support, it raises the ranking. Another classification of maqasid is into the am and the khas, the general and the specific. The general objectives of Sharia in Islam are those which permeates the entire Sharia in Islam itself, like the objectives of justice, human dignity, consultative government, for example, consultation itself, and prevention, alleviation of harm. In every area of the Sharia, this remains the general objective. But those which are more particular may be identified with reference, for example, to sale. What is the objective of sale? It's transfer of ownership. What is the objective of giving testimony? Is to establish the truth. These are the specific objectives. Another classification is maqasid asliya, maqasid tab'iyya, original maqasid in supplementary maqasid. The original maqasid are those that are essential to the ahkam of the Sharia in the first order. What is the original purpose of ilm, of acquisition of knowledge? It is knowledge of God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the manner of worshipping Him. What is the objective of marriage? It is procreation of the human being. These are the original, the Sharia has identified. These are objective. But tab'iyya, subsidiary maqasid, for example, for marriage, in addition to procreation, it's sexual gratification, companionship, so on. These are subsidiary maqasid. Al-Shatibi has lastly added another classification of maqasid, which is those of the lawgiver, identified by the lawgiver, and those which are identified by those that are related to in human beings themselves. The lawgiver's general objective is human welfare behind the ahkam of the Sharia, for example. But the mukallaf, human being, may have additional objective for their activities, for example, of gaining knowledge. It may be to acquire a certain skill or a diploma or a certain type of work or employment. These are the maqasid of the mukallaf. The purpose of these classification is to make the task a little easier when we try to determine the priority of which over which, should there be a conflict between the various maqasid. Then this would help us to identify that this takes priority over the other. And it is important to read the ahkam of Sharia together with the objective and the purpose of the Sharia. When there is a distance developing between the two, there is distortion. Even the prayer, if the purpose of prayer is submission to our Creator, but one who prays in a public place for reason of hypocrisy and so on, that prayer counts for nothing. You see the importance of the purpose together with the hukum. If there be difficulty in identifying the correct order, we refer to consensus and to special. The next question I raise is with regard to the identification of the maqasid. This relates to the question of weaknesses in the methodology of maqasid. And here we are making progress on that methodology. How is it identified? How do we know that this or that is an objective of the Sharia? The first approach taken is that we look at the clear text, the nusus of the Quran and Sunnah. In this I have mentioned, and Al-Shatibi adds, provided that the text is original and it is explicit, tasrihi ibtidai. It is not supplementary to another text, and it is not open to doubt and speculation. Then also the areas of commands and prohibition is where we can look for the maqasid when we look into the Quran and Sunnah. Al-Shatibi, the principal advocate of the maqasid, says this, that the maqasid, commands and prohibition, is always to be given priority, and we look at these in the first place. But it is not enough. we also look at the objective rationale, the purpose of the ahkam of Sharia together with the actual text reading. And this is, of course, a step away from the kind of the approach that was taken by Imam al-Shafi'i. Ijtihad, an innovative thought, interpretation, according to al-Shafi'i, is confined to the text, and after the text it is analogy or qiyas. And qiyas itself has speculative components. In the early times of development of Islamic jurisprudence, this was a highly disputed subject, qiyas. When you read the text of the Quran on the subject of wine drinking, first the question arose, ijtanibuhu, avoid it. Is it a prohibition or is it only educational, a certain advice? Khamr, for example, the word that occur in the text, in the language of the Arabs, refer to that kind of wine that is extracted from liquor, from grapes. The question arose whether other substances are also included. And then, of course, whether this prohibition was confined to the Arab society of the time, is it permanent, whether a small amount and a large amount are fall under the same ruling. And of course the four pillars of qiyas, and each of them have conditions to fulfill. This is a long route towards ijtihad. The other approach that al-Shafi'i, that al-Shatibi advocate is the maqasid oriented approach towards the reading of the ahkam in the ijtihad itself. The mega purpose of the maqasid is human welfare and maslaha, also hikmah or wisdom behind the ahkam. And also that we read in our effort to identify the objectives of Sharia, pay more attention to the asbab al-nuzul, the occasions of the revelation. This is an area which has to some extent been not given a degree of prominence in the earlier writing. If you compare that to what Fazlur Rahman writes about the importance of the occasions of revelation, this gives us a certain understanding of the purpose, original purpose of the rulings of Sharia, and it is a useful tool for the identification of the maqasid. For the most part, al-Shatibi says that the nusus, that the textual injunctions of the Quran and Sunnah convey their objectives also without any difficulty. We understand that. But then beyond the nusus, he raises a question that at times there are references to certain value points and objectives, although we don't have a clear injunction on that. And there is a number of references in the Quran, for example, but none of it is by way of a clear text. Can we extract the maqasid or the objective, a certain objective, from our general reading of the text? And that is the contribution, the main contribution of al-Shatibi to the methodology of the maqasid. This is inductive reasoning or istiqra. At times we have several texts, none is decisive, but the collective reading and weight of the text leave us in no doubt that this is an objective of the Sharia. For example, we know that 5 or 6 of the essential of the maqasid are essential or dururiyat. How do we know it? There is no clear text either in the Quran or Sunnah to tell us that this is so. But we know this from our general reading, and this is a definitive conclusion. Similarly, we classify them into 3 main categories and several other classifications. There is no text on that, but we know this is the case. We have, for example, the general understanding that ibadat, matters of worship, are not subject to ijtihad. How do we know this? There is no clear text on this, but our general reading of the nusus tell us that it is a definitive conclusion. So istiqra, or inductive reasoning, is a method, a tool for the identification of the maqasid, not only identifying a certain purpose or objective, but also commands and prohibition can be identified through the inductive approach. Should there be, we said that the decisive injunction, commands and prohibitions, and now we say a general reading, these are the way of identification of the maqasid. But I raise a question toward the end of this discussion, that in our times there are all sorts of questions in the context of legislation, and may arise. Should there be persistent doubt, then we should refer to consultation, whether it is parliamentary or other level of consultation, and specialist opinion and ijtihad that may also help the identification of the maqasid. And finally, my discussion is the importance of the maqasid for ijtihad. Al-Shatibi and many other scholars went on record to say that a mujtahid, a scholar and jurist of Sharia, must be knowledgeable of the objectives, the goals and purposes of the Sharia. Anyone who neglects that will do so to his own peril. You look at the approaches, the understanding of the companions of the Sharia is very, very purpose-oriented, and that is that we must retain the spirit of that approach, that we should look always at the general and the more specific objectives behind of the rulings of Sharia. Sometimes among the Khawarij and the Ahl al-Bid'ah and those who indulge in pernicious innovations, and they give preference to the doubtful aspects of the Quran over those which were more clearer, the mutashabihat, for example, over the muhkamat. And the Sharia, according to the majority of ulama, is a unity, an integrated unity that follows certain distinctive purposes, and we should always keep in sight of these. Tahir ibn Ashur, a 20th century scholar, supports this line of discussion, and his advice is it be a mistake to indulge into this reading of the ahkam away from its objectives. Here he gives examples. Some of the early scholars have also made errors. Imam Malik, a very prominent alim, of course, an imam, he was asked a question about a person who pays a zakat ahead of time. Does he need to pay it when the time comes? And he thought about it. He said, he drew an analogy with the prayer or salat. Salat, if it is offered ahead of this time, should be repeated. He gave the same, by way of analogy, the same answer to zakat. This was mistaken. Of course, the purposes are different. I have already mentioned that sometimes in the area of punishments, it's not the punishment, but some other objective that is more meaningful, like the granting pardon. In the area of contracts, sometimes when you apply a contract literally, its situation changes and it amounts to injustice and unfairness. And then the judge and the jurist look at the objectives and make the necessary changes so that the idea of the larger maqasid, fairness, justice, is brought into the meaning of the contract. We discussed the idea of qiyas and istihsan. analogy in juristic preference. We set aside a certain analogy and bring an alternative ruling in its place because of for a certain purpose. It's all a maqasid-oriented approach. We further read that maqasid and ijtihad are relevant. We pay attention also to the consequences of conduct and of rulings. Like the Prophet ﷺ himself has done that. At one time, his wife, Aisha Siddiqa, asked the Prophet, why don't you change the actual place of the Kaaba? The Kaaba was not on the place where Ibrahim, the Prophet Ibrahim, had initially built it. The Arabs had changed it. The Prophet's answer to that said, I would have done that, but my fear is that people will be misguided and will sway them into disbelief. So he was looking at the consequences. Even something would have been right to do, but the purpose, the consequences did not permit it. There is this, Al-Shatibi has given an advice to the judges. They look, of course, at the purpose and rationale of rulings, but sometimes there is something more to consider. A witness, when a witness is upright, he becomes admissible. His testimony has become admissible. But when you look at the particular individual as a witness, in some other perhaps episode or story that is attached to that individual, even if it's upright, the judge may not accept him. This is something that is very much purpose-oriented, has to do with ijtihad, has to do with insight in the reading of the objectives of the Sharia, and it is an important tool for ijtihad. The mujtahid should have comprehensive knowledge, not only of the readings of the injunctions and the ahkam of Sharia, but the objectives that they incorporate into their constructive and innovative thought in ijtihad. Thank you.